Okay, well, I'm back. I'm going to walk you through how it got started, how all this came about. The first intro was pretty much saying, hey, this is what's happening. You know, my life just kind of, and I wouldn't say it got turned upside down. It got, if anything, put on its correct path, the way that I believe, right? The way that my thought process is, my life is now on the projection it should be on at this moment. And I wouldn't have changed anything from the past because to give an outlook of who I am and how I think, I very much think, you know, every decision you make, you know, it's going to change your life. If you open the one door, you're going to have a different path in life if you open another door. And I truly believe that. And I believe I went from a name in the alphabet that is different on both sides. And I won't be using real names. I'll be using different names through this process. And I would have been sat beside different people in school. I would have been, with what I've done for a living, put in different sections and various different things, and been on a whole different projection in life from the time that I showed up for school, how they do things. So, and I'm very happy with my life and what I've done with my life. So with that, I have some videos that I recorded already that kind of goes into who the man who raised, who I thought was my father, and how he was, and then also my mother, and then this is my journey that I kind of know some stuff already because it's been 2 weeks, and if anybody knows me, I like get hyper focused on something and just get as much information as fast as possible and turn over every single stone I can to get the information, and then after I get it, it's like, okay, like on to what now? So this is how it got started. So I went on to MyHeritage DNA and did the DNA thing 2.5 years ago, maybe 3, just trying to see where my African roots are. I'm black and white. My father who raised me is black. So as you can see, and what issue might arose there, and then my mother is white. So I ended up getting like a match 2.5 years ago, and I actually reached out to the person, or they reached out to me. It was like a 5% match, and they were like a second cousin removed, or one of those type things. And then I had about 4,000 people that were like all over the world, right? And I only got it to just see where I was from. So I was like, my mother, Becky, you'll hear me refer to her as Becky this entire time. So that's the only real name. And I'll refer to Cliff, and that's his real name. Just because that'd be extremely hard for me not to do that. And I call them Becky and Cliff anyway. And it started out calling Cliff to upset him because I wasn't calling Daddy anymore. And it's just how it's been for years. So that's what's even more interesting. So went on MyHeritage 2.5 years ago. I chatted with the person who is like the distant cousin. She's messaging me, and she's in the same area as where Cliff grew up. So thinking nothing of it, right? Very nice to meet that person. And I even pretty sure that growing up, the little bit of interaction I had with Cliff's family, that the last name was similar to parts of other distant relatives they had. So it made sense. And plus they were in the same towns, in the same areas. And it was literally maybe a conversation back and forth, maybe 3 or 4 times we communicated. And that was probably it. And didn't speak again for until all this came about. And this person, she was very key to all this, but didn't know that 2.5 years ago. So about 2 weeks ago, I get an alert that I have a half nephew. And I'm like, okay. So I go on and see what the percentage is, and this person's profile's locked. Now they hadn't been on for 6 months. So somehow it got connected or something, and trying to read the MyHeritage thing, which it is an amazing thing, and Ancestry.com is amazing, and I was able to learn so much stuff these 2 weeks. I'm glad that I recorded some of it. But the tough part is I didn't record like the actual website, which I should have. I was recording my reaction to stuff, right? But I wasn't talking either, which kind of stunk. But because I didn't think anything would come of this, right? So it says I have a half nephew in Germany. So I'm like, okay, Cliff's brother was in Vietnam and stayed in Germany, as many black men back then did. And he had 2 children. His son never came back to America, so I'm thinking it's his kid, right? Like that it's just my cousin's kid, and somehow it got higher percentage. And then some other website said yes, it could be your a cousin's kid, and it just the way that the DNA works. Sometimes he just had a higher match to me, like with stronger certain things that mix. I'm like, okay. So, but the kid was in his 20s, okay, and it said the last name Gray and the last name Thomas. So I'm like, okay. I'm seeing this and I'm like, okay, like that's not anybody's in my life's name. Okay, so then I end up seeing that the person I talked to 2 years ago is 5% of that person too. And I reached out and said, hey, do you know any Grays? And she's like, oh yes, they're my cousins. I talk to them all the time. And she's like, oh, so I was like, well, it's saying that I have, a half nephew. So basically I have a half like brother, sister out there. And she's like, well, I'll get you information. And she's like, I'll reach out to them and kind of tell them that you're interested to try to find out some stuff. So this whole time, right, up until the phone call that I'll go into in another video, I'm thinking it's Cliff, right? So he worked away my entire life growing up. I've had a very distant relationship with him because he was a teacher by degree, and I found out stuff when he was older, so I don't want to make it out like he ever presented himself. He just said he never got a job, so he took a job on a railroad. Come to find out, it was very prejudiced back then in my hometown, and another teacher told me who actually got hired over him, and he was junior, and he opened up and confessed to be, a couple years ago. He's like, oh, your dad was such a nice man, and I'll never forget they didn't hire him, and that teacher ended up changing my life to get me back on path. So it was very interesting because I was very close to that teacher as well. So we're thinking, my sisters and I would joke about stuff. So we're thinking he worked away 5 days a week. So he'd be gone and only come home 2 days a week. Through my childhood to adulthood, he was only home an hour or 2 a week that I got to interact with him because his days off and he'd go back. So we're thinking, we joke like, well, maybe, it's going to pop up and we're going to have kids on his side. So I'm instantly thinking, oh, like my dad might have been with somebody. And it's more of like not being offended, be like, good for Cliff. That sounds funny, but when you hear some of the other videos and see them, you understand why. And he had a conductor. So he was an engineer. He's a teacher by degree, worked on the road and had an education. So he ended up moving up very quick and became an engineer. And when I was growing up, he had a conductor that people take the tickets, right? Because this was in New York City, so it was a metro train, who was black from England. So I'm like, oh, maybe she had friends to come over. My dad ended up, because he was friends with her, but he was friends with all, male, female, all of his conductors. He's always friends with them. Anytime he's with a conductor, he stayed friends with them, and then I'd end up meeting him and stuff like that. But I'm like, oh, rooting for him almost, which sounds sad, right? But it's because he was never there. Like, he pretty much would come home and then turn around and leave right away. So, like, imagine, and that's my entire childhood, I remember, to graduation. We didn't even know he was going to be making my graduation, and he showed up. So he didn't have weekends off until probably a good 6 or 7 years after I graduated high school. So that's where it was like the whole time I was like, oh, Cliff, like, I call my sisters and I'm like, or text them, I'm like, I was like, I got a half sibling out there somewhere. So, and they're not a sister, so I'm like, we have a half sibling out there somewhere, thinking that. So I go through the process and start finding these people out, start being more real. Like, okay, there's literally something going on here. And at the same time, I'm thinking, like, okay, like, my dad had a kid somewhere, and it's probably someone he met from the conductor, and, they went back to Germany and had a kid, and maybe he knows, maybe he doesn't know. I don't know. Because when I got to my heritage test, he was so excited to get it too. And then something happened, and that's a whole other story in my one video too I talk about, that was interesting. But he was excited. He paid for 2 of them, and I did mine already, and he was excited to see where his roots were and that type of stuff. So I'm talking to this woman during that time, the person that was on my match, right? And she's kind of giving me the right names, because when I found out the name, Mr. Gray, like I started searching all of them, right? So I ended up finding people in this area of the country, and kind of being like, I wonder who it could be. And then hers, they weren't really in the system at all, right? At the time, she had connections through them, and she knew them because they're her cousins, right? Like, so she's older, but they were her cousins, right? Like, so it was interesting that she was actually knew who these people were. So she was able to help me and also reach out to them and say, hey, is it okay? This person's going to reach out. So she was a great help. And again, from MyHeritage.com, somebody helped me, right? Not only did the website help me, and then hop on Ancestry.com was amazing. And just, I progressed from a very small tree to 3,000 or 4,000 like actual closer relatives than like those distance ones that I see, which is pretty interesting. Above the 2 to 3%, I think that's what it said, which was interesting. So that night, I message Becky and say, hey, do you know this last name? The Grays or the Thomas? Because that's the only name, because the stuff was blocked out on the person who was my nephew besides the last name. And she's like, no. And I'm like, from the 70s, 80s? She's like, no, I don't know anybody from that. I'm like, okay. And then I was like, all right, she called me up right away, right? She called me after that, and I was like, I'm laying in bed, I'm not gonna pick up the phone, it's already late. So then Becky goes, good night. And that's how I'm gonna start my next video. So how I knew something was up, it's because Becky texted me good night. If she would not have said good night, I don't think I would have I might have just let it go, thinking it is what it is, and there's probably an error on the MyHeritage, because I was reading some certain things that could come up and certain connections, but you just might have a higher DNA thing with somebody else who might be a distant relative. But the fact that she said good night is actually when it really started. So I'll be hop back on here again to start how it all started with a good night.